Welcome back to this final part of Murder with Friends. Today I'm talking about Dean Corll with my roommate and friend, Jay Light. Jay, where we ended in part 2 was the night of August 8th, 1973. This is when Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. as he would sometimes refer to himself, shot Dean Corll. And this is a night that we really have to unpack from beginning to end. But just to give you an idea of what we're gonna be discussing, let's go to this first element narrated by Amir.
On August 8th, 1973, tension between Corll and his accomplices reached a boiling point. Elmer Wayne Henley brought 15-year-old runaway Rhonda Williams to the house. It wouldn't be a big deal, he thought. She just needed somewhere to stay for the night. After another evening of heavy drinking and sniffing varnish, the kids passed out. Henley woke up hours later to find out that they had all been tied up by Corll, who was enraged at Henley for bringing a girl into his home. Henley pleaded with Corll to spare his life, even saying that he would rape and kill Rhonda if it meant that he could live. Corll then untied Henley and ordered him to do just that. Terrified and flustered, Henley couldn't perform, much to the sick delight of Corll, who began mocking and taunting his young partner. This proved too much for Henley, who swiftly reached for Corll's .22 caliber pistol and sank 6 bullets into his chest.
So Jay, that's sort of the cliff notes of what took place on that night. But between 3 a.m. and 8 a.m. when Henley made that 911 call, so much went down. From what you just saw there, what more can you fill in?
So a really interesting thing to note about the actual murder of Dean Corll by Elmer Wayne Henley is the taunting that was going on was not just about Henley's own performance. There was a certain point when Henley had the gun and Corll deliberately and directly said, "Kill me." And he told Henley to shoot him. Probably not thinking that he was going to do it, but he did it. He shot him in the head initially got him right in the skull. The bullet did not penetrate his skull, and Corll was still staggering around. So more shots were fired. And Corll's body basically was naked, fell against the wall, and he died, and they never moved his body from there. The 2 youths who had been manacled and shackled up to the torture boards.
I think that's important to clarify as well. So
never actually got tortured beyond being bound and gagged. And Henley also woke up mid being gagged by Corll. Like he came to from being passed out, from being crossfaded, for lack of a better term, while he was being prepared for the same torture and murder that all of his other victims had undergone before.
Yeah, and he knew.
He knew exactly what was going to happen.
He knew what was happening. So Henley brings a girl to the house. It was actually someone he was seeing at the time.
Yep.
And as well as her, there's another youth named Tim Curley that shows up as well. So when this all starts going down, Henley now has to reason with Corll, his abuser, but also sort of his co-conspirator. And he says, you know, okay, let me go, let me live, and I'll help you torture these people. And then Dean Corll was gonna take Tim, and then Henley was going to abuse Rhonda.
Right.
And reading the accounts of this, it plays out like a horror movie.
Yeah.
And the hours that were spent in just absolute madness and chaos, and reasoning with someone who you know is incredibly capable. And has this, again, quote, bloodlust.
I think there's a lot of bravery on the part of Rhonda Williams here too, because Rhonda Williams is the person who I think initially put in Henley's head that he didn't have to follow Corll's instructions. And because when basically Henley came on and said what was going to happen, and she directly questioned him, said, "Are you going to do this, or is this really what's going to happen?" And I think that was the first time that doubt had been cast in Henley's mind at all with any of the things that he was involved with Corll. So Rhonda Williams deserves a lot of credit for, I think, sort of helping the first domino fall in what eventually led to an insane bloodbath sort of night where the tables are flipped and turned on Dean Corll.
Yeah, you see this years of mental abuse and conditioning, and Rhonda was instrumental in just poking a hole in that. Like you know, presenting a counter option that Henley had probably not considered since things had come to pass with his relationship with Dean Corll. And I agree with you. I think she is sort of the heroine of this story. Now, he makes a 911 call after he shoots Dean Corll. He calls 911, he says, "I killed a man."
Yep.
Police show up to the apartment, and the three of them, Tim, Rhonda, and Henley, are sitting outside.
Sitting on the front porch. The 22 is sitting by them.
And they have no idea what to expect, really. A man's been shot. Why? Oh, maybe they're friends, something happened. They have no idea what they're about to uncover.
Right, and they get inside and they're arresting Henley because he admittedly killed Dean Corll. But then they get inside and then they see the torture boards. And they see the equipment that was being used by Dean Corll and by Brooks and Henley over the course of their span of killing. And that's when they have to start deepening their investigation and really uncovering what was going on.
And Henley confesses, but as I understand, his confession is sort of questioned by the authorities at the time, because they're like, that doesn't, what? You're talking about like a child sex slave ring, and that all these missing boys but are all related to the murder of Dean Corll, this, you know, well-liked, decently liked Candyman in town. That doesn't really make sense. But then Henley starts saying names of boys who have mysteriously disappeared and saying, if you go here, this is where you'll find them.
They tell them about the boat shed at Lake Sam Rayburn. They go and start exhuming bodies and digging up the boat shed.
As I understand, on that first day, they found 17 bodies on just that first day, and there were other burial sites as well that Henley led them to.
Right.
I found a news broadcast of Henley calling his mom, because all the news went there. They knew that something afoul had gone down, and you can see Henley in handcuffs, and he calls his mom. It made the 10 o'clock news that night, saying, "Mom, I killed Dean," and it all plays out a little bit in real time. The footage that you can find on YouTube, which if you know, don't eat when you do it, but you can find it, is incredibly graphic, and it was, you know, it predates a lot of the regulations that we have now for what could make the evening news and what would be blurred out. It's crazy what is out there. So he calls his mom. By 10 p.m. Texas is on high alert. They confess, and then by August 14th, they've been indicted by a grand jury. Initially, it was on 3 murder charges for Henley, and then eventually 1 count for Brooks. Although by the end of all of this, Henley was indicted for 6 murders and Brooks for 4.
And they're receiving multiple, I believe, I'm not sure about Brooks, but I believe Henley received multiple 99-year sentences.
Oh yeah.
He received something like 5 consecutive 99-year sentences, where it's because they are also still, I don't believe they're minors anymore at the time, but they could not be, they couldn't get life or death penalty sentences based, I believe, based on their age.
Yeah, and also Henley was not charged with the murder of Dean Corll because they ruled that as self-defense, which
totally fair. It's exactly what it was.
It's totally fair. And now there are some more recent developments into this case that I think we should get into. Namely, there was some forensic testing on 6 more bodies that were uncovered that do seem to be related to Dean Corll. This was discovered between 2008 and 2011. So the case is still developing, and you found something online as well.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, there was talk very early on when Henley was brought on as an accomplice that that Corll was selling his victims into what he called a white slavery ring, essentially human trafficking. Now, recent investigations have turned up that there was, as sort of what was described in Dallas, a human sex trafficking ring involving teenage runaways. Those victims were cross-referenced with the victims of Corll's crimes, And something like 14 out of the 27 identified victims were potentially also victims of this sex trafficking ring. So what we might have on our hands is something that Corll was not just bullshitting about, something that Corll was actually more deeply involved in other crimes other than just doing stuff for his own pleasure. He may have been involved in something a lot larger that crossed multiple cities, maybe even crossed outside of state lines.
Yeah, so are you frustrated in some sense that because Dean Corll's life was taken, we don't get to know about his psychosis a little bit? We also, they are still searching for bodies. Bodies are still needing to be identified. There's some bodies that aren't identified.
Yeah, some bodies that still have not been identified.
It's frustrating, right? Like you don't want this killer to be glorified. You don't want them to have attention for being a monster. But at the same time, there is sort of the dignity that comes with just this is how this person's life ended.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that did frustrate me the most about researching this case is that there's a lot of information out there about what happened to the victims and what happened after the fact to Brooks and to Henley, but there's not a whole lot of information out there about Dean Corll himself. And I think that if Corll had not been shot dead by Henley that night in August, then we would be able to potentially have a much more robust profile of Corll, obviously, because you'd be able to interview him, but also the research that has been done into serial killers in the wake of this could have been started a lot earlier, because the depths to which Corll's depravity ran through him are things that I think would be very, very interesting to find out earlier on than they were able to establish stuff with the CIA and the FBI researching serial killers and actually coining the term serial killer. I mean, this span of murders took place before they even had an idea of what it could be. And after the fact, they were able to start labeling the method with people like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy. And just imagine the kind of profiling that they could have done if Dean Corll was alive and able to be interviewed, because all we have to work with is his accomplices. And they were, as we could probably guess, largely doing it out of a desire for money and for whatever sick, twisted, sort of familial relationship that Corll developed with these two accomplices of his.
Something I found online was people arguing that his accomplices were victims, in a sense. What is your response to that?
I think that they are victims in a sense, but the other flip side of that coin is they knew what they were getting involved in. I think that Brooks knew a little bit more than Henley, and I think that is something that we can kind of take into account, especially given that Corll also abused these boys emotionally, sexually, mentally. And I think that really, the fact that he groomed them to help him perpetrate his crimes like this has to be brought up and has to be considered when you consider this case as a whole.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is they were active, willing participants after a certain point. And they are certainly victims of different behavioral modification that I'm sure Corll was able to inflict on them through the use of money and emotional and sexual abuse and mental abuse. But after a certain point, they helped a man murder somewhere north of 27, 28 people. To the point where we can't even still identify some of the bodies. And I would put a bet on the fact that there's probably more victims out there of Dean Corll's crimes that we don't know about.
I would agree, and I think what it comes down to for me when I have that discussion is two things can be true. They can be victims, and they can also be criminals.
Yeah.
And I think just seeing the tie-in, we talked about Columbine as well last season with you, finding these murderous pairings, it's troubling and it's difficult to analyze. It's puzzling for those of us who have never experienced that. But two things can be true.
Yeah,
it was a duo, like a team of monsters.
The real fact of the matter is that bad people create worse people.
Yeah.
And these boys may not have been predisposed to engage in this activity, but they were associating with somebody who absolutely was predisposed to engage in murder, torture, rape, sexual abuse. So the fact that they were in his inner circle for such a long time, directly engaging in what he was doing and helping him to trick teenagers and bring them in. They may be victims, but they are also completely complicit in what was going on.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great place to end today's show. We want to hear from you guys in the comment section below. Had you heard about Dean Corll before? If you had, I know a lot of you guys recommended it. Share your thoughts on this case. I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more Murder with Friends. We'll be back next week. We'll see you then.